Okay, great. Let me introduce myself, and then we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Brian, Brian Robertson. I'm the founder of Holacracy, and for me, this journey started as an entrepreneur, oh God, almost 20 years ago now, a little less, 18 years ago. I started a company, and I used that company as a laboratory. I experimented. I just had a sense there's got to be a better way to run a business. And I didn't know what it was, but I had my own company and I wanted to find the answer. So I held that question for years as I experimented. And over years of experimentation, the thing that finally resulted was this thing called Holacracy. And my goal today is to give you kind of a whirlwind tour, a big picture. What is Holacracy and what is the paradigm it's coming from? What's the underlying paradigm or some of the principles that you might see in this system? And I'm sure, sorry about that. I'm sure I'll leave you with more questions than I answer. I hope I will. And I'll leave you with some next steps as well for how you can dig deeper if you want to continue this exploration. So thank you for being here. Let's go ahead and dive in. And I want to start with a story. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my slides here. Here we go. Okay, great. So again, if you're just joining now, welcome. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A as we go. We'll queue most of them up for the end. And also, please feel free to type in the chat and share insights or thoughts as we go. But I want to start with a story. It's a true story from my journey that kind of led me to what is now this new framework for organizing a company. And it's when I was flying an airplane. So I'm a private pilot, but at the time this story happened, I was still a student pilot. I didn't have a license yet, but I was learning to fly. I had about 20 hours of flight experience under my belt. And it was time for my first cross-country solo flight. That's my first flight where I'm flying hundreds of miles away from home with no instructor in the plane, my first solo cross-country. So I get up in the plane and I start the journey. I barely knew how to fly the plane at this point. And on the journey, the low voltage light came on. And I definitely didn't know much about the hardware of the airplane. I didn't really know what that meant. It was just one of the warning lights on my instrument panel. And if you've ever seen the inside of an airplane cockpit, there's a lot of instruments. One of them was glowing at me, a warning. And so I didn't know what to do, but my instinct was check the other instruments. Right? So one by one, I looked at every other instrument on my control panel. And every single one of them said everything's fine. Right? My altimeter said I'm not losing altitude. My navigation aid said I'm perfectly on course. My airspeed was perfect. My navigation, fuel, everything was fine, except for the low voltage light. So I figured this must not be that big of a problem, right? If only one instrument is reading anything anomalous, it must not be that big of a deal. So I basically let the other instruments outvote the low voltage light. I said, I'm just going to ignore it and keep flying. Turns out that was a really bad decision. Turns out the low voltage light was actually tuned in to information that none of the other instruments had. And when I let all the other instruments outvote it, I let that kind of group perspective dominate this one individual instrument sensing something that nothing else was, I nearly crashed the airplane. I ended up completely lost in a storm with no lights, no radio, no navigation, almost out of fuel, and violating international airspace. So it was a bad situation. I did make it down alive, barely, it was a close call. But when I did, as I'm reflecting on this, I realized this is what we do in organizations all the time, right? Often when we humans show up in organizations, each of us senses something different. We are different instruments, different sensors. We have different backgrounds, different roles, different skills. We tune into different things. And often it's one lone person or a small group that senses something that no one else does and then has a really difficult time driving change. Have you ever been the low voltage light in your organization? Ever had that experience of you're sensing something and yet others don't see it? The boss doesn't see it. The majority doesn't see it, whatever. And it suddenly becomes incredibly difficult to drive change. Even if they do see it, the time it takes to convince everyone fully of what you're sensing and what's needed. it's really hard to drive change. So for me, this sent me on a quest. I realized I was doing this as a CEO at the time and an entrepreneur. I had built an organization where a lot of people sensed things and then couldn't drive change, which was exactly what I wanted to escape by starting my own company and leaving the corporate world in the first place, right? I was tired of being the low voltage light. So that gave me the question, how do I build an organization where anything sensed by anyone, anywhere in the company, has somewhere to go where it can rapidly and reliably drive meaningful change? And I held that question. I didn't have an answer, but I had the question. And I held the question and experimented for years, and that's what eventually led to Holacracy. But let me ask you a question now, and I'll invite you to share your answer with me in the chat. If you've ever been the low voltage light in your company or seen others who have, what do you see limit the ability to drive change? What gets in the way in companies today? What limits us from being able to drive change in organization? And just type into the chat for me, whatever comes up. What comes up when you think about that? What limits change in organizations today? What obstacles do we have? What gets in the way? And I'm going to read some of the ones coming up in the chat. Lack of decision-making process or authority. Yeah, I like the way you framed that, Jason, that was. A lack of decision-making process. Sometimes it's just not even clear who makes this decision and how, right? So we have defaults. We default to calling a big meeting and discussing it, and that's where needed change goes to die sometimes, right? Or lack of clear authority, not knowing who has the authority to make this decision. Tradition, the way things always have been. We're in just a pattern that seems to be a self-fulfilling system. It's just things work that way because they used to work that way. Why did they originally work that way? Who knows, right? But you get that, and then the inability to kind of move the needle or change the pattern. Often, even when everyone within wants it to change or at least isn't stuck on it, it seems like the system self-recreates the system as it exists then. Yeah, a lack of trust sometimes. And I think even deeper than that, there's something about our environments, our work environments today, where trust seems to be the output. Lack of trust seems to be the output. I've seen wonderfully trusting individual humans show up in a business setting together, and suddenly no one trusts each other. And that's fascinating. I think that maybe is less to do with the people and something to do with the system itself engendering this lack of trust. It's almost like trust isn't safe, or there's something that makes trust not what's selected for in the system. Older, outdated rules that, again, are back hard to change. Beliefs, I love that. Behaviors, identity, safety, habits, leadership. Sometimes when the boss doesn't see it, it's really hard to drive change, right? When the leadership doesn't see it. And on the other side, it's so easy to defer our power to the leaders, to the bosses, right? There's this dance that happens where those in the front lines give up their power to those above who eagerly suck it up, often well-meaning. It's my responsibility to lead. And then change doesn't happen. The people at the top are overloaded. The people at the bottom feel frustrated and hopeless. There's something in the system that reliably, predictably recreates that dynamic. I could go on. There's so many here. Fear, yeah, the politics of it I see. There's so many here. And these come up again and again when I ask this question. I hear these answers all the time. And interesting, we saw how broad, diverse you all are watching this, right? We have people here from 5 continents, and yet we're seeing the same answers that I see all the time. It does not seem to matter what culture I'm in when I ask this question, whether I'm talking to people in large companies or small, government, private, public. I hear the same answers again and again and again. To me, that says there's something underneath in our organization, something about the system itself that's reliably, predictably creating these. It's almost like these aren't things going wrong with our companies. These aren't anomalies happening. It's almost like our organizations today are perfectly designed to give these results. May not be the intentional design goal, but they can't be anomalies if it's happening, and I'm hearing these answers so reliably all over the world. There's something in the fundamental design of our companies, and that's both the good news and the bad news. The bad news is That means if you want to drive change to some of these patterns, one of the things I found is there's no patching the issue. There's no individual surface level process, the level of change work you have to do. If it's true that these things are coming because of the fundamental design of our system, then the only way you're going to transform them is by changing the fundamental design of our system. And the good news is if you can do that, it's really deep change, and I think it can transform so many of these dynamics. And that fundamental system that we're used to today, ultimately, is how power works. I think these issues predictably, reliably come from the way we structure power in companies today, the way we structure the flows of power and communication. And we do that right now through typically a top-down command hierarchy. This is the way the vast majority of companies in the world are organized. And I think if we want to change these dynamics, what I found was we had to question this. And I didn't start there. I never set out in my work. I never set out to remove management hierarchy. I never set out to, which is what I get credited for, but that wasn't the goal. Never set out to like throw out hierarchy, or even with the sense that there's necessarily anything wrong with this. I wanted to solve some of the patterns and dynamics I saw. I just assumed that this was the only way to organize at first. When I started my software company, where a lot of this was pioneered, when I started that company 18 years ago, I never sat down with my founders and had a conversation. How do we structure power? Do we want to centralize it all in a CEO and then break it down a hierarchy of managers? Right? Or do we want to do it a different way? I never had that question because I just took it as a given. It was an unconscious decision. I just assumed that we needed to scale, of course, so this was the only way to do it, right? What I learned over the course of my journey was there are other ways to structure a company. And Holacracy is one. It's an alternate way of structuring a company. And it comes from a different paradigm. With Holacracy at play, you do have order. One of the common misconceptions I get with Holacracy is when you throw out management hierarchy, you must be throwing out structure, which in my mind would be throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as they say, right? There's so much need for structure. It's just the kind of bureaucratic, rigid structures that get in the way, that can't be changed, that are inflexible. So the irony of that assumption people sometimes have, a misconception of Holacracy, that it's structureless, that couldn't be further from the truth. Companies running with Holacracy today have more structure, not less, than a management hierarchy. But the kind of structure is one of emergent order, not top-down imposed order. Right? Think of the way we have society structured today. Right? I can pretty much fly into any modern city and trust I can find a place to eat and a place to sleep and transportation, and I don't have to have a supply chain management department figuring that all out in a top-down plan. Right? We have these networks now that just respond when I have a need. It's really quite remarkable. Even the old top-down kind of networks we had, like government taxi cartels, are getting disrupted and undermined now by other forms of order. And this is the kind of order that isn't, it's both chaotic and structured at the same time. In a society, we have a framework of order. There are laws and regulations that keep us operating safely together, but that framework doesn't tell us exactly what to do within it. It doesn't tell us, you need to go here and be here, and oh, Brian's flying in, pick him up at the airport, drive him to a restaurant, get him a meal. Right? Another great example of this kind of emergent order, or a framework within which there's a lot of dynamic control and freedom to self-organize. In a society, we have the freedom to self-organize within a framework. Another great example is the human body. In the human body, we have trillions of cells working together, but there's no CEO cell telling the others what to do, right? This is how life organizes. There's no top-down command hierarchy of cells bossing around other cells. There's no breakdown that way. But we do have a breakdown. It's just a completely different kind. Every cell in our body has autonomy to self-organize. It has its own inner workings. It takes things in from its environment. It does its work, its thing, and it has some output. But within that, there's no other cell poking in and structuring it. and telling it how to do its job. There are constraints in the system within which it has the freedom to lead its own function. You know, and then those cells, though, they're not entirely independent of each other. They're integrated. And that's the job of, say, an organ. Right? The heart's job is not to boss around all the cells and tell them how to do their jobs. It's to build on their autonomy. Right? The heart takes the muscle cells and the nerve cells and the blood cells, and it integrates their individual functions into a larger function. A function that kind of transcends all of those individual functions, but it still honors their autonomy and integrates it. Right? And that itself is just a part of a larger system. It's part of a cardiovascular system, which again doesn't tell the heart what to do, but it builds on its autonomy for a larger function, which is part of us. And that's why we can sit here talking about how we organize instead of thinking about how do I get blood to that cell that needs it there to oxygenate the muscle, whatever. We don't have to think about that. That's handled at every level of scale. There's a kind of a container that handles complexity. So the broader level doesn't have to worry about it. It can just build on top of it. I realized that's what I wanted as a CEO, right? I didn't want people coming to me with every little problem. As a CEO, I often felt I was dealing with the biological equivalent of people running to me and saying, well, wait, how do I get this oxygen over to this, cell that needs it? I didn't want to micromanage that level of detail. I wanted a system that ran itself. I wanted to free myself up to think about the kind of roles I filled, which were more about business strategy and what new markets do we enter, new products do we develop. Those were my main roles. I wanted to focus at that level and let others focus at their levels and all work together without needing that kind of top-down control. The body does this really well. It doesn't need a top-down command hierarchy. The more we learn about the body, interesting in modern biology, the more we see even our ideas that the brain was somehow the master top-down controller. It's actually not totally true. That was us taking our existing paradigm and mental model and applying it and seeing what we wanted to see from that lens. We've now discovered there's massive systems throughout the body. The gut has nerve cells that control so much in our system. Every organ has this a fundamental control function in some way of our system. We're learning this more and more. So Holacracy then is a different framework for running a company other than management hierarchy. And it's a framework that's built on these kind of other ways of getting order. It's a framework for allowing emergent order to show up. A framework within which we have a lot of freedom to self-organize. But it is a framework and it is a replacement for the management hierarchy. And that makes it pretty unique. And that's also the bad news. This is what makes it so difficult to implement. Holacracy is a complete replacement for the management hierarchy. I see a question here posted in the Q&A of how is Holacracy different from Agile? Agile also has concepts, if you're familiar with it, of self-organization or self-management. The thing is, Agile is not a replacement for the management hierarchy. It's built on top of it. Right? You still have that fundamental power structure there with just the ideas or the principles of allowing more freedom for self-management, which indeed you can do. As a boss, this is what I tried to do. I ran an Agile software company, and I tried to give people the space, the freedom to self-organize. And I tried to be an empowering leader. And when they need me to empower them, they're in a fundamentally disempowering system. If you need someone else to empower you, your system is disempowering. You are reliant or dependent on empowering leaders, and there's not enough of them to go around. When you get a really good empowering leader, they do great work, and they get promoted and often replaced with somebody that's not that good at that, not as empowering, not as good at creating clarity and giving freedom within boundaries. So Holacracy is a complete replacement. Companies running with Holacracy today no longer have anything that looks like a management hierarchy. There is no CEO, there are no VPs, there's no bosses of any sort. It's a different way of getting to order than breaking it down a hierarchy. It's a pretty big change, and that makes it really difficult and deep. But it's also not impossible. Like any deep level change, it's also incredibly transformative if you can make it through the change process. That's the hard part with this. So let me tell you a bit more about it. And I want to start drilling into some of the principles, and then I want to show you an example. So one of the things I found about my own journey of trying to empower others is that real empowerment requires boundaries. These are some of the things that I see early on in people's journey towards wanting more empowering work environments. The temptation is often to throw out boundaries for good reason. We're used to boundaries that are bureaucratic, arbitrary, and get in the way. We're used to policies and rules that are just not serving. But real empowerment actually takes them. Let me say it another way. If you don't know the boundaries on your freedom, you don't know your freedom. If you don't know what you can't do without talking to someone, then you don't know what you can do without talking to anyone. If you don't know your limits, you don't know your freedom. So if you want really deep empowerment, it's not enough to try to remove boundaries. You need the right boundaries. And you need clear boundaries, more clarity. This is one of the ironies of Holacracy. People think it's structureless. It is more structured. It's just differently structured. People often assume when you throw out managers, all decisions are made with consensus. And that couldn't be further from the truth. With Holacracy, more decisions are made autocratically than in a management hierarchy. The difference is they're not made autocratically up a hierarchy. They're made by clarifying boundaries of who decides what. And within those boundaries, everyone has the freedom to lead their part. When it's your role, you know you have the freedom to lead. Right? Real empowerment requires clear expectations. When you're needing something from someone else, for you to be empowered, you need things from others. And you need to know, and they need to know, what you can expect from them. Right? If you don't have clarity of expectation, you get stuck really fast, and you default back to either running it up a management hierarchy, if there is one, or you call a big meeting to get consensus, both of which tend to shut down that smooth flow of processing everything that we're sensing. When we have to slow down and call a big group meeting and build consensus, not everything gets addressed. Not everything gets processed. We get the tyranny of consensus, where everyone has a voice and no one can drive change effectively. Okay, so let me get more concrete and show you an example. Holacracy puts this all together in a role-based system. So with Holacracy, work is broken down into roles, and a role is not a job. It's not an entire thing that someone does. It's one chunk of work. So I have about 30 roles I fill in my company. That's a lot, but most people find they have, oh, I don't know, 10 roles plus or minus, maybe more. So a role is just one unit of work. Here's what I'm doing right now. This is my spokesperson role. Every role has a purpose. Holacracy is a purpose-driven system. The company has a purpose. The organization as a whole has a purpose, and we break it down. Every team has a purpose, and every role has a purpose. And then my role has some clear expectations. These accountabilities are things others can expect of me. And it doesn't matter if I'm the founder of the company. Everyone has a right to expect me to own and manage these activities. And they can come and they can ask me to take on actions or projects that fit these. I have a duty to do these things. There is no status hierarchy here. There's no hierarchy anymore at all. There's just me with these roles, with these expectations. And so there's responsibility, and with that responsibility comes true power. The golden rule of Holacracy is to serve my role. I can make any decision or take any action I want as long as there's no rule against it. Any decision or any action, even if it's outside what I already normally do. This is the opposite of the way most companies work. In most companies, there's an implicit culture. Don't make decisions that you don't usually make without permission. And you get permission in one of two ways in most companies. You either run it up the management hierarchy, right, until somebody gives you the authority, somebody blesses the decision. Or you call a big meeting, which in my experience is actually more common. You try to get all your stakeholders bought in, and that's how you get permission. With Holacracy, you don't need it. You have the authority and autonomy to use your judgment. If you want input from somebody, get input. But don't get it because you're scared of owning your role and leading. Right? Get your input because you want to make a better decision. And as soon as you've got enough input, cut it off. So I frequently will go to one of my colleagues and say, hey, I've got some input for you. Would you like it? Usually they say, yeah, sure. Sometimes they say, no, you know what? I don't need more input. I'm confident in my decision. Thanks. And sometimes I give them my input and they say, wow, that's really great advice. Thank you. I'm going to take it in and change what I do. Sometimes they say, yeah, thanks for your input. I'm going to go a different direction. Can't tell you how few times as a CEO in a management hierarchy, I heard somebody, when I gave them strong input, I heard somebody say, yeah, thanks for your input. I'm going to take it and go a different direction. Right? That doesn't happen in management hierarchies to CEOs much, if at all. And in this environment, there's no hierarchy anymore like that. right? Not a command hierarchy. It doesn't happen. Instead, there's a bunch of roles, and anyone filling the role has the autonomy to lead their role within boundaries. I have expectations here, and I have boundaries. So here's a way we limit roles. Here's another role I work with, our web architect role that deals with our website. And this role has what we call a domain. Think of the domain, a domain as property of this role. This role controls our website. And what that's telling me is in my spokesperson role, I can do anything I want to do my purpose. But if I want to mess with the website, I need to check in with my colleague Olivier, who fills this role. I need to check in with him, and I need to make sure I'm not going to cause harm on the website before I can take my action that impacts the website. Just like in society, right? I can do anything I want to live my life, but if I want to go, take my neighbor's car, I kind of need my neighbor's permission. That's my neighbor's property. Right? We're used to this in society, but in companies, we don't have clear boundaries. And without clear boundaries, we don't know what's ours to lead, and we don't know when to check in. So we default to checking in all the damn time. So with Holacracy, I don't need that anymore. I know my freedom to lead. I know the expectations and responsibilities on my leadership, and I know the boundaries of when I need to check in with somebody else and make sure I'm not going to cause harm. And it doesn't matter if I'm the founder of the company and he's our newest hire. He controls our website. There's a domain there or a property. I need to check in with him. I need to get his clear statement that whatever I want to do is not going to cause harm in his area. So that said, if you want to see this not work for you, one of the mistakes that people often make, they stop at this point in the presentation. They get excited about this way of clarifying work and boundaries, and they go try to clarify it all. They go try to say, let's define all our roles in this way, and let's define all our expectations or accountabilities and all of our domains, our property boundaries, and then let's tell people they're empowered to lead their roles. That doesn't actually work. When you do it that way, what you get is a lot of bureaucracy. You recreate structure you don't need. Right? You end up with way too many roles or too little, actually both at the same time. You miss ones that you really do need, and you end up with bureaucracy you don't. You add way too many accountabilities typically, and you add domains you don't need, right? Or you don't know you need, and often you don't. So what you really need if you want an empowering environment is not upfront clarity like this. You need a process to generate clarity on demand when it's really needed, no sooner. So real empowerment requires a process to generate and evolve boundaries, to change them and set them. You can't get this right up front. You need to start with the minimally sufficient, lightest weight structure. Sometimes lack of structure is exactly what you need. It works. If there's no tension about it and you only have some really vague roles and everything just works smoothly, why waste your energy trying to document and clarify them? If everything's working, let it work. Instead, what you need is a process for people to sense when something is limiting, when something's in the way of you getting your purpose met, and then evolve the structure to get it out of the way. And with Holacracy, we do that tension-driven. So it's not just designing from theory, right? It's designing based on the feeling you get when you have an actual gap between what is and what could be. When you feel that gap because you're trying to get work done. You have a purpose to meet, it's expressed at this level, and you see an opportunity to express it better. Or something's limiting and getting in your way, creating an obstacle. Right? So the goal of this kind of iterative design process is not to design from our theory about how we should structure. It's to design from the lived reality. What are we actually encountering along the way? And Holacracy's way of doing this is to add a governance process into every team. So every team in a company using Holacracy has a regular meeting, a governance meeting, and there's a way you can do this asynchronously outside of meetings as well. And it's about once a month for a mature team, maybe more frequently early on. The team will meet for this governance process, and anyone filling a role on the team is invited to show up in this governance process. And in that process, they can propose a change to the structure of the team. They can propose new expectations on other roles. They can create roles. They can merge roles, split roles. They can create new domains or property boundaries. They can create new policies that kind of govern parts of the team's process. And then every team's doing this for its structure, and anyone on the team's invited to show up and participate. Right, so this is my company's org chart, and a little zoomed in version of it here. We have all these circles. Every circle has a governance process. It's a team. All these green and blue dots are roles. Right? Every role has its autonomy to lead, but it's grouped into these circles, and every circle is self-governing. So this lets us evolve clarity. Let me give an example of how this has showed up in the past in my company. This is a true story about my spokesperson role. When I first created this role, I proposed it myself long ago, realizing, you know what, somebody needs to be out there like doing this public speaking and all these conferences that we get invited to. This was just starting to ramp up. So we created the spokesperson role. And when that role was first created, it had a purpose. And I think it had one accountability, and that's it. Right? We didn't try to document everything we thought the role should do in theory. We stuck with what we knew right now. Right now, we knew we needed somebody kind of going and doing speaking. So we had some initial accountability around that. And we had a purpose. Really simple. And we started just working together. Somebody filled the role, I did, and we just started working. And let me share where this third accountability came from. The one that says defining criteria for acceptable speaking engagements. Right? That wasn't there when we first created the role. That came about after we were working in this role for a while on our marketing team that this role's a part of. We had a tension surface, and it came from a colleague of mine who fills another role called casting agent. And the casting agent role was booking me for talks. So we get a lot of invites to go do presentations at conferences. And those go into the casting agent role, who has to sort through them. And she has to figure out which to say no to. When she finds one that she thought might be a good fit, she would build a relationship with the conference organizer. She'd explore their audience. She'd negotiate with them. She'd come up with some terms of what my talk would be, and the financial realm, the whole thing. She'd negotiate everything with them, and then she'd present it to me at the end of her process. And sometimes I would shoot it down. I'd say, no, I'm not going to go do that talk. It doesn't serve my role's purpose to do that talk. It feels like the wrong market, or the audience isn't big enough. It's not worth the time, or whatever. And she felt really disempowered. She said, it's really hard for me to do my purpose when I spend all this time and energy, I build a relationship, and I get shot down at the end. So she showed up in our governance meeting, and she made a proposal. She said, I propose we add this accountability, the third one here, defining criteria for acceptable speaking engagements. She said, because if I could see that criteria in advance, I could assess it for myself. Right? I could consider for myself, did this fit the criteria, and not waste my time up front. Right? So she said, I want to be able to count on that from your role. And I don't have time to go through the full governance process with you here, although we'll leave you with a link to dig deeper if you want to explore it more. It's a really cool process. It doesn't use consensus. There is no group consensus that comes from that. But there is a question that gives everyone a voice, which is, does anyone see any reasons that adding that expectation on spokesperson role will get in your way of doing your work? The change is automatically accepted if no one can express a tangible reason why adding that expectation will get in the way of them doing their work. And if somebody does have a reason why that will get in the way, that doesn't stop the proposal. It just gives us a puzzle to solve. Then we have a little problem-solving session of how do we solve their issue without getting in the way of someone else's work. Right? So in this case, no one saw any reasons why that would get in the way of their work. It's pretty easy, clear expectation. So it took about 2 minutes in this meeting to get that expectation added to my role. And then after the meeting, she was able to turn to me and say, so when do you think you'll have that done for me by? Like some initial draft documented. The interesting footnote to this story, I'm the founder of the company and a seasoned CEO from my past. She was our newest hire right out of college. In what companies do you know where the newest hire right out of college in 2 minutes can add an expectation onto the founder and then turn to him and say, so when are you going to have that done for me by? Right? I don't know many companies where that's true. And the reason that was possible here is because it wasn't about the personalities, the status, the egos. Think of how long that kind of change might have taken in a typical structure. How much politics might be required. Even if you have a really enlightened leader who wants to lead in a really good way, it's still hard. The structure makes it hard, or the lack of structure. But now we have a process for it. Right? There's a really clear process for evolving the organization structure. I think that's really remarkable that it allows that level of change that quickly with no politics in the way. No politics required. It doesn't magically make people free of politics. It just gives us a better way to drive change where we don't have to use politics to do it. I think politics often come because it's useful. Right? That's how we have to get things done in companies today. But there's a better way. You just need a framework that gives you a better tool than politics. And then politics naturally die down. They don't go away entirely, but they die way down when people have a better avenue to drive change. And all of these pathways, the governance process, the rules of the game of Holacracy are captured in a rulebook, the Holacracy Constitution. It's an open source document. Holacracy is an open source framework. You can see it on our website. So there's somewhere over 1,000 companies today running with Holacracy, and they're all using this rulebook, right? The same general set of rules. And that's because this rulebook doesn't tell you specifically how to run your business. Then it wouldn't be used by 1,000 companies. It wouldn't be generic. What it does is give you the framework or the meta process. It tells you how to run the governance process within which you can define whatever roles your company needs and whatever policies you need and whatever processes you need. It doesn't tell you what those should be. It doesn't tell you how to hire people or how to fire. It doesn't tell you how to pay people. It gives you a governance process where you can experiment and iterate on all of these other processes. And you're going to have to do some interesting experimentation because you don't have a management hierarchy to lean on anymore. You can't just fall back and say, the boss decides. There is no boss. You have to get clear, how should this decision work here? And you have to define the roles you need for it, and the processes and the policies and the domains and boundaries that you need honored. And it gives you the meta process to make that evolution easy or easier. Easy once you get used to it. It's hard to get used to, but once you do, the thing I hear most often is, I would never go back. The learning curve is hard. It's big. It's huge. But I hear again and again, I would never go back because this makes driving change easy. It makes iterating on everything else in the business easy once you get it, once you know how to use it. The Constitution also gives you a new seat for power. Instead of power ultimately vested in a CEO and broken down a management hierarchy, now power is ultimately vested in a constitutional process. So CEOs who are adopting this, once they decide to adopt it, they sign a declaration ceding their power as CEO into the Holacracy Constitution and inviting everyone else to hold them to this power structure. To say this rulebook now is the ultimate authority, the ultimate law of the land, not the CEO. Now, interestingly, the rulebook gives the CEO who adopted it retains the right to unadopt it. If it's not working for you, throw it out. Right? It needs to work better than what you came from, or it's not worth doing. But the commitment in the meantime from that CEO is, I won't violate the rules for expediency. I will play by the same rules as everyone else, and they're the rules captured in this Constitution, and you can hold me to them. If I decide at some point this is not the right rule set for us, I retain the ability to throw it out, at least until they go so far as to write it into the organization's bylaws, which, by the way, has happened in many companies now. There have been legal adoptions where they're actually encoded in the bylaws. But I don't recommend that at first. Try it. See if it works better. It should. The point of Holacracy is not just to be an egalitarian system that gives everyone a voice. The point of Holacracy is to serve a purpose and to organize around that purpose. The recognition is giving people real empowerment and real autonomy and real voice to drive change works better for serving a higher purpose, a higher calling in the company. So try it. See if it does, if you're interested. Okay, let me summarize and then we'll move into our questions. So, summary of the key shifts. We go from these static job descriptions, and let's be honest, when was the last time you looked something up in your job description? Right? When was the last time you checked a coworker's job description to see what you could expect of them? People don't do that because they're not real clarity. They're bureaucratic artifacts. But now with Holacracy, you have dynamic roles, and they're real and they're clear, right? And people do look things up. There's a software tool called GlassFrog. That's where the screenshots with the cellular organization came from. GlassFrog is, Laura, can you share a link to GlassFrog for us in the chat here too for people? GlassFrog stores all that clarity for you, so you can go look up your roles and your colleagues' roles, and they're evolving constantly. Every governance meeting, you're doing a micro reorganization of your company. And because you have all these clear roles and a process to iterate, you don't need authority delegated down a management hierarchy anymore. you have constitutional authority. Instead of a CEO empowering managers, theoretically, and then theoretically empowering workers and clarifying what's expected of them, instead of that, you have a constitution that clarifies a governance process. And that governance process is used to clarify roles. And when you get a role, you have the authority to lead it. You have a real authority backed in a constitution. And that means because it can iterate and adapt, you don't need the giant reorgs that happen in companies every few years. You need tension-driven iteration. You need to do a micro reorg every couple of weeks in a governance meeting, driven by real tensions. What's in the way of the work? Not theory, not mind, but real gut-felt, emotionally felt tension. What is in the way of me getting my purpose expressed? Let's use that to drive change and iterate and test and see what works. Right? It's an evolutionary design process. When I look at the structure of my company, I can't tell you who designed it. No one did. No group designed it. It was the emergent result of governance meetings happening every few weeks in every team with everyone in the company involved. Evolution designed my organization structure, and it works better than any design I could have come up with. And because we can iterate like that, we don't need to play politics to get alignment. We can just clarify the boundaries and expectations. We can get alignment in a process that is intentionally impersonal. Because it's not about you and me and the human relationships. It's about the relationships. It's about what your role needs from my role to get our shared purposes expressed. Right? We're organizing around a higher purpose, not the politics. And we have a process to actually do that and support it. And to me, that creates a profoundly more human organization. We don't need to use our relationships anymore the way we do in companies today. We can just be human together. We can drive change together. We can listen. We can own our autonomy without stepping on somebody else's ability to own their autonomy. And we can work together and have collaboration and integration without losing ourselves in a codependent mess. If we looked at a typical business team today, they look like giant codependent families where nobody can make a decision without everyone else's buy-in. Right? And then there's all this weird subtext and politics, and those are not the kind of relationships I want in my personal world. Holacracy creates them, and it gives me practice in my work every day, creating the kind of human relationships that I most want, where we honor each other's autonomy in interconnection. We know the boundaries, we lead our part, and we work together, we collaborate, we connect. So I hope that gives you a taste of some of why I love this. Let me move into our question block. I don't know, I feel this is, it's deeply meaningful work to me. I think more than anything else right now, our world needs more empowered people. And more iteration and more experimentation. And I want our businesses to be a place where people can practice that. And practice it together with other humans doing the same, without all the pain I see in companies today. So, okay. With that said, I'll get off my soapbox, and thank you for listening. If you're sticking around for the Q&A, please type your questions into the Q&A. And we'll take them from there. If you've shared one in the chat, I may have missed it. So please make sure to post it in the Q&A so I can see the questions. And I'm going to pull up my, my question sheet here. Here we go. So apologies in advance if I don't get to yours. We'll take whatever ones we can in the next 10 or 12 minutes. So here we go. I see a question. One of the very few pros of autocratic rule is that decisions can be taken quickly. It can be vital for companies, absolutely. How can this be ensured in Holacracy? I hope this might have been an earlier question. Hope you've gotten a sense now. There are more autocratic decisions in Holacracy, not less. It's about clarifying the boundaries of who makes which autocratic decision. So if you need someone who can make a fast autocratic decision, create a role for that and give them the real clear purpose and accountability for making that. And then they have the authority to lead. They don't need anyone else's buy-in. And some decisions you really do want to connect with other roles. So for example, we have a role in my company that chooses, we do a lot of Holacracy trainings all over the world. We have a role that gets to choose what venues do we use for our trainings, what hotel or other venue do we do our training in. And that role has the authority to autocratically decide. But in this case, we wanted a constraint. That role has an accountability for aligning the venue selection with the requirements from the training design. Now that doesn't mean training design gets to dictate or approve a venue. They don't. But they get to say, here are the requirements. We need a room with windows. We need this kind of feel. We need this kind of space. You find a venue, right? So Holacracy enables us to give autocratic power, but within responsibilities or limits to it as well. And sometimes you don't want that. You want somebody who can just make a decision with zero limits around this area. Great, do that. This is far faster decision-making because of that. This was actually measured. There was an interesting metric. There was a department in the Washington state government that adopted Holacracy. And they actually did some metrics. One of the things they tried to measure is before and after Holacracy, how many meeting minutes does it take? That was their metric, right? Meeting minutes, so minutes spent in a meeting of some sort. In order to get to a clear action or clear decision from somebody else when you need it, right? Or for yourself, when you need a clear action or clear decision, how many meeting minutes does it take? After 6 months of Holacracy, the number was reduced over 90%. There was an over 90% reduction in the amount of meeting minutes needed to get to a clear decision or clear action in the company. I hope that gives a taste of that. Okay, let me answer another one. What are the differences between Holacracy and Teal organizations? So yeah, I love this question. If you're not familiar with Teal, go read the book Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux, who's a friend of mine. Really amazing, inspiring book. He also writes about Holacracy in that book. And then many people find reading that book first to be useful and then reading my book after that. Let me answer this with a quote. What's the relationship between Holacracy and Teal? Tony Hsieh, the CEO of Zappos, said it really well. He said, Teal is the goal, Holacracy is the way. So Teal is a paradigm. It's looking at a framework. It's looking at, sorry, not a framework, principles. It's looking at the kind of big picture paradigm of organization. Holacracy is a tangible practice that expresses that paradigm. So it is the path to getting to the Teal paradigm and principles. In fact, to my knowledge, it's the only real complete framework for getting to Teal. Otherwise, you can home grow it. There's lots of people doing Teal by just reinventing the wheel, from my perspective, or hacking together their own custom homegrown approach, right? Which is fine. It takes a long time, and there's a lot of mistakes you can make in the way. Or you can use an existing framework to get you to Teal. And that framework gives you guide rails. It's still infinitely customizable. Holacracy is not a one-size-fits-all. It doesn't tell you most of the processes you need in a company. Holacracy doesn't tell you what they should be. It gives you the framework to iterate and evolve them and design them towards Teal. So it is a framework for going Teal. Similar question, what about Agile and the connection to Agile? So you can, again, Agile is a set of principles, and then there are Agile methods, right? So to separate those, so there's Agile principles, the idea of Agile, and then there's Agile practices, right? Like Scrum or extreme programming or whatever. Holacracy is a set of practices to embody a set of principles or to get you to that broader paradigm. Agile as a set of principles is great, but what I found running an Agile software company is the Agile practices were all focused on software development. They were, how do I build a software company? And they were coming within the bounds of a management hierarchy-based power structure, which often created interesting clashes, right? Like the broader company had a budgeting process that was really an old paradigm process, where they had authority structures in place. And then there was the Agile software team trying to do this like more self-managed, empowered thing, clashing, and then the corporate antibodies would come out and attack the Agile team. I guess saw that all the time. Holacracy is a set of practices that will embody Agile principles. It actually grew out of that. Holacracy grew out of me asking, how do we bring Agile principles to the entire organization and every aspect of what we do? Holacracy is a complete replacement for the management hierarchy that will bring you Agile operations everywhere. And it's completely compatible with Agile software development practices as well. My company has GlassFrog, our software tool, the official Holacracy software tool. And that one, it's made by a team running Scrum and Agile methods. Agile gives you a set of default methods, right? We have roles that it gives to start with, and we have processes that it gives to start with. And then Holacracy wraps this framework around them to iterate on them, to say, well, what about in our environment, what do we need to change in the template of how to do Scrum? Right, we're a virtual company, and we realized we needed some tweaks. Pairing was more difficult and more important, so we created a role that was championing pairing and trying to set up the technology and to make pairing easier for people. For example, forgive me if you don't understand what I'm talking about and you're not from the software world, but I hope if you are, this is making some sense. So Holacracy wraps around the basic starting framework that you get from whatever agile method you use, and it lets you iterate and adapt it. And it lets every other part of the organization with the same meta process iterate and adapt everything they're doing without collapsing to the boss decides. Okay, cool. Let's see. We have time for a couple more. How do you rate projects or even, so budgeting. Holacracy does not give you an answer for how do you do budgeting. It doesn't give you an answer for how you pay people either, or how you fire people. These are all important decisions. But that's, to me, what I think is so beautiful about it. It doesn't prescribe a one-size-fits-all approach to any of these things. But it lets you propose anything you can dream up in a governance meeting. And more importantly, it lets you change them. So let me turn the question around. When you first adopt Holacracy, you keep budgeting however you've been budgeting. You keep firing or paying people however you've been paying people. But have you ever had tension, felt some tension with the way your company budgets or project manages or hires or fires? Have you ever felt any tension about that? And if so, do you have a reliable process where you can go and propose a change to improve things easily without massive amounts of bureaucracy and politicking and painful consensus building and all of that? The goal of Holacracy is not to give you the perfect answer for these processes. It's to give you the iterative mechanism so that you can start wherever you are. However you budget now, start there. If you rely on your managers to budget, well, start by relying on your ex-managers that don't really do that anymore. Create a role for that, right? Like we have one company, they were 30 people and the CEO adopted Holacracy, and before Holacracy, the CEO fired everyone. I mean, he didn't always fire people, but that was his decision. And so when they adopted Holacracy, they started by just matching that, mapping that. They created a role for it. They called the role the executioner, true story, and they gave that role the authority to fire people autocratically because that's what they had always done. That was no different. It wasn't an improvement. It was just being honest and transparent. This is the way things work around here as of when we start. There is an executioner role. One person fills it. It happens to be the ex-CEO. CEO is no longer a relevant title in Holacracy, but the ex-CEO filled that role and still had the same authority. And then, a little later, one of the roles charged with their culture, filled by someone else, an HR kind of person, had some tension with that and proposed a change to it in the governance process, and it changed. And they started with a small change. They had a policy that said that role can only ever be filled by a minimum of 3 people, and it takes a majority of them saying, I would make that decision too, in order for the decision to get made. That created that addressed a tension that people were scared of being fired from pissing off the wrong single person. And that made it a little better. And that lasted for some number of months before somebody proposed another change, and then another. And so they iterated on it until they had a much better way of firing people that felt much better, worked, and didn't create the same fear in their culture. And yet actually was more effective at firing people. My company did something similar. After 7 years of evolving our firing approach, I can genuinely tell you, I love how we fire people. And I don't know many companies that can say they love how they fire people. For me, it feels deeply human and honoring of the person getting fired and of everyone staying. It treats people like adults, not like children who need to be judged and fired separately from them being in part of the discussion. They're part of the discussion. But it's also effective. We don't let people stick around like we used to when we had a more traditional firing process. And I find it beautiful to see that integration. It is faster and more effective at getting the wrong people out of the company. And it's so much more honoring and human. And we didn't get there because Holacracy said, here's the one right way to fire people. I don't know that our way would even work in your company, but it works in mine. And it works because 7 years ago, we had a shitty way of firing people. And somebody felt tension and proposed a change. And then another and another and another. It's that evolution that's the goal of Holacracy, not the right answer up front. Okay, cool. So what if someone doesn't follow the rules? Sounds like a tension. What do you do in a management hierarchy if somebody blatantly disregards important rules of the structure? I don't know what you do in Holacracy, but probably it's not that dissimilar. You need to address it. You can't ignore it. Maybe you need a role for that, right? Maybe you need a process or a policy. Maybe you need to say, hey, look, hey, you could propose, anyone has the authority to fire somebody as soon as they break the rules. I think that's a terrible idea, but you could propose it. Somebody else might raise what we call an objection and say, wait, that'll cause harm in my role's ability to get my work done. Right? And then you'll integrate that and you'll find a different answer. So I hope that gives you a sense of it. If you have a tension like that, you solve it. The goal of Holacracy is not to prevent tension. It's to give you the tools to solve them. So many of the questions that I see on this list, I don't have time to get to them all. My answer is just, that sounds like a tension. I don't know how you solve that. And that's not the point of Holacracy, to tell you the right answer. The point is to let you use your judgment better. Right? So whatever it is that you feel tension about, propose something, try something, experiment, iterate. All right, so I'll try to squeeze in one more here. What exactly is the change process? How long is the adoption process? I don't have time to fully answer this, but let me use this as a cue to direct you to more information. The best thing you can do is to get a coach. It really is a hard change. It's deceptively simple looking, and it's really hard. And the failure rate of companies that try to adopt this with no coaching and no training is very high. The failure rate of companies that adopt this with a good coach is actually pretty low for a massive change like this. And somewhere in between is you get somebody internally trained so that they can be your internal coach. It's really not as ideal as having a good external coach, but it's somewhere in between if you're budget constrained. So check our website. You'll see on there a whole path for here's how to adopt Holacracy. Reach out to us. We can walk you through. We have an agile approach to the adoption of Holacracy, the coaching, and it's different for different companies. We have kind of a menu of different things to need to get done, a measurement model as well for what needs to happen, what you need to measure. But then the way of getting there is pretty dynamic, and it's a partnership with the company being coached and us as coaches. We also have a network of coaches all over the world that do this work. We have a whole licensing model for other professional firms that get trained up in Holacracy to deliver it to their networks and their local markets. So you can find more on our website about all of that. We do trainings if you want to take a deeper dive. There's a 4.5-day deep dive Holacracy practitioner training that really goes into the processes of Holacracy in more depth and how do you live it and practice it. The next one of those is coming up in Amsterdam in like 2 weeks or something. And then after that, we'll be in Austin, Texas in October. And you can find more of those on our website. So we'll also be in India and China before too long. But our main hubs, the ones we do most often, are Austin, Texas in the US and Amsterdam in Europe. We do them regularly there. You can find a list on our website. There's also lots of free resources and blog posts and things like that on the website. There's a whole community with discussion forums that are all free to use. So those are great free resources to kind of dive deeper as well on there. There's my book, of course. You can read more about all this in my book and dive in deeper that way. And reach out. We're always happy to schedule a call with you if you're interested in exploring what an adoption actually looks like and walk you through it and try to also customize it to your situation because it does look different for different kinds of companies. And we see companies all over. We see big, small, for-profit, non-profit, governments. I mean, it's a pretty diverse group that's adopted Holacracy. The key is you have a leader that really wants it. You have a leader that wants to lean into a different way of organizing and is kind of ready to take that challenge. If you think you might have that, the best bet is to kick the tires, as we say, or get a taste of it, an experience of it. And we have a number of ways to do that before you take the big jump to actually doing it. We do 2-day workshops with executive teams all the time to help them really try it on with their real issues, where we kind of run them with Holacracy for 2 days, and they get to like really see how that works. And we have other workshops and other ways you can kind of get a taste of it. So again, reach out, and we're happy to go into more detail about any of that. We also have an online workshop you can find on our website if you want to, from the comfort of your own home, get a little bit more of a taste of it. It's about 4 hours in total, and we actually do a simulation of the governance meeting and another key process of Holacracy, so you can kind of like start getting an experiential feel for it that way. So that's on our website as well. And with all that said, we're at the end of our hours, so let me wrap up here, and thank you all for joining. Really appreciate your time, and whether it's Holacracy or something else, I just appreciate seeing so many people out there all over the world that are actually looking at new paradigms for organizing. I really believe that can have a huge impact in our world. So thank you for your curiosity and your interest, and good luck wherever your path with this takes you. Thanks.